Francis isn't a good guy. Plays the good guy. Francis is all about the money.
I don't know what is his problem, man.
And this guy's ego just was so out of control.
But I think the problem is that he can handle this loss.
I didn't like Francis as a person.
I'm sure he's been praying for my downfall, and then I'm just keep doing my thing.
Francis Ngannou, the Cameroonian, is a knockout machine and a walking highlight reel in the cage. But he remains in the headlines equally for his power and stunning knockouts and his explosive relationship with the UFC, especially Dana White. It's unbelievable to think that Ngannou was once earmarked by Dana as the golden boy of the UFC heavyweight division, but things took a nasty turn and went downhill from there. At this point, the cracks in their relationship look unrepairable. This has become one of the most heated beefs in recent combat sports history. This whole thing has been brewing for several years, and trust me, it's a saga with many twists, turns, and bewildering claims. So stick around because we're breaking down how it all started, where it went wrong, and what the future holds. Let's get into it. Before we get to the beef, let's talk about Francis Ngannou's story, which is beyond anything Hollywood could dream up. Born and raised in Cameroon, Francis had a childhood marked with extreme poverty, where he worked in the sand quarries at age 10. He migrated from Cameroon across the Sahara Desert to Europe in pursuit of his dream of becoming a professional fighter. He made his UFC debut in 2015 and claimed the biggest prize of them all, the UFC Heavyweight Championship, after taking down Stipe Miocic. Now he's the PFL Heavyweight Champion and has had dream fights in boxing. But it's not all about his fighting credentials. The Predator has fought through a lot, and he had insane grit and determination to work his way out of the slums. That's a big part of why fans have always respected him. But like with many success stories, the road to the top isn't all sunshine and rainbows. There's some serious conflict brewing behind the scenes. In the years following his rise to fame, Ngannou had a great relationship with Dana. He had a fairy tale run until his title fight with Stipe Miocic. Dana was waxing lyrical about him every time his name came up.
Francis Ngannou has the world record for the most powerful punch. His punch is the equivalent to 96 horsepower, which is equal to getting hit by a Ford Escort going as fast as it can.
So here's where things start to get really interesting. After his epic rise through the heavyweight division, Ngannou hit a major snag. He got his title fight against Miocic, and the Cleveland icon trounced him, exposing his game plan with zero wrestling. His next fight against Derek Lewis was easily one of the most boring bouts ever seen in the heavyweight division, and this is when things with Dana began to sour. In fact, their fallout became super public. Dana lambasted him at the press conference.
Before the Stipe fight, he took off and went to France. Didn't even really train for that fight. And you see the results. Well, then he comes back and he did train, but ego is what hurt Francis Ngannou.
The situation went in the back burner for a while, but Francis again rose back to earn another title shot. And finally, the Cameroonian was the UFC champion after he knocked out the champ Stipe Miocic. Things generally ease out from here, like with all the other fighters who butted heads with the UFC once they became champs. They got the blessings of the big bosses in the organization, but not with Le Predator. Now, can you guess what the simplest way is to piss off the UFC big boss? Simple, just speak about fighter pay. I mean, when a YouTuber based on his popularity is getting 20 million, why shouldn't the best of the best in the UFC get anything close to that? Once that happened, White went ballistic on Ngannou.
But that's a fact. He was offered more money. Because I know the real numbers.
Francis wanted that slice of the pie, man. He was chasing big money while also chasing after his dream of being a boxing champion. They went back and forth in the media, with Ngannou calling out the UFC's lack of fighter benefits and White blasting Ngannou for being difficult and ungrateful.
You don't want to be here, you don't have to be here.
Anyone who doesn't have to be here, doesn't have to be here. You know that's not true, right?
Ngannou was on the last fight in his UFC contract and fought Cyril Gane. Despite being injured pre-fight, Le Predator defeated Bon Gamin via a majority decision. With no news of positive talks, Dana took public shots at his manager Martin Markel. Dana even shadow banned Markel and his clients in the UFC. Now Ngannou started pushing back even harder, pointing out the issues in the UFC's treatment of its fighters. But it wasn't just about fighting now. It was about respect, money, and how he felt the UFC was treating him.
I had some personal encounters with him as did other people in the organization. And this guy's ego just was so out of control.
Ngannou had been vocal for a while about wanting a better deal with more opportunities for sponsorships and a bigger share of the pie. When the UFC refused to budge on these demands, Ngannou made the call to leave.
You know, this is the most dangerous sport in the world, and the UFC, you know, makes billions of dollars a year, and they're only paying their fighters 15% of that.
It's no secret that UFC fighters are often underpaid compared to other combat sports athletes. Ngannou is publicly calling for higher fighter pay, more respect for fighters, and better fighting perks like insurance and other things. In comes the PFL, the biggest competition to the UFC since Pride folded. PFL, bankrolled by the Saudi regime, landed the big fish. This was a strictly business move. Ngannou was looking for a platform where he could make more money, get more freedom, and not be restricted by the UFC's tight grip on their fighters. Once he parted ways with the UFC, the beef between Ngannou and Dana White officially hit peak levels. Dana White wasn't beating around the bush anytime and went straight up at Francis. He implied that he would have earned more in the UFC had he chosen to sign, but let's be honest, there's no data to back that claim.
They pay you whatever they want to pay you. They let you pretend that you're negotiating while you're not negotiating.
Ngannou, of course, clapped back, saying that Dana was more interested in controlling the fighters than actually helping them. It was basically a game of who could expose the other more, and neither side was pulling punches. Dana even took time to slander the PFL for giving him his mega deal.
Based on what I know about the deal, which is not much, it makes no sense to me.
Dana, before saying anything, says, "I don't know much about his deal," then goes on a rant for 10 minutes. I mean, that should be the argument closer for Francis, but even if he knows everything, why not keep his name out of your mouth? But Dana leads an organization which is under threat if more and more top fighters were to leave the UFC just like Ngannou did, so this is just a face saver for him. Let's talk about Ngannou's keen interest in boxing. While being in the UFC, he teased a fight with the Gypsy King Tyson Fury. Ngannou went ahead and had a close fight with Fury, in which he shocked the boxing world by knocking Tyson to the floor, but he lost a close fight via the judge's decision. Next up, he was on the end of a brutal knockout from Anthony Joshua. Surprise, surprise, here again, Dana White wasn't exactly supportive of Francis in boxing. Dana has often been critical of the way boxing is set up, especially the pay structure. He's even said on several occasions that the pay structure is broken and unsustainable.
The sport is so broken and so, so corrupt.
Sure, boxing isn't always about truckloads of money. Just look at the Nate Diaz situation with Fan Mio Inc. But even with all the drama surrounding it, boxing continues to be a lucrative business. And then came Ngannou's return to the MMA world, making his debut with the PFL against Renan Ferreira. Not only was he bouncing back with 2 high-profile boxing losses, but he also came back from the heartbreaking loss of his 15-month-old son Kobe. He finished Renan, and even in this spectacular moment for Francis, Dana had something to say.
First of all, the PFL should keep the UFC out of their mouth. They can't even deal with Power Slap. Power Slap destroys PFL.
But Dana, did you hear about how much Renan Ferreira made in the title fight opposite to Francis? Dana would not even think of mentioning this anytime soon. Renan Ferreira's purse for the Ngannou fight was a $2 million payday, plus any sponsorships he had, which obviously the UFC prohibits. Who in the UFC can claim to have a fight purse of $2 million? Well, nobody apart from Conor McGregor and the title holders in the UFC. This is a sad state of affairs in MMA these days. This only happens when you have a monopoly in the MMA world like the UFC does. So the relationship between the UFC and Ngannou is so bad that they pretend he never existed. And that's where it felt pretty petty. I mean, Dana, come on. He is the same power puncher you used to push to the moon. And that leads us to the final question. What's next for Francis Ngannou and Dana White? It's hard to see them squashing the beef anytime soon. So yeah, the feud could keep going for a while. It might even heat up again, depending on how both of their careers play out in the coming years. For Francis, his legacy is still being written. Will he become a boxing champion? Will PFL grow to be a legitimate challenger to the UFC? Or will he fade into obscurity? There's a lot on the line for him in the coming years. As for Dana White, his legacy in the UFC is cemented, but does he risk losing top-tier fighters if more and more athletes start following in Ngannou's footsteps and taking their talents elsewhere? The future is uncertain, but one thing's for sure, the beef between Ngannou and Dana White is far from over. Before you go off, make sure sure to check the video on your left where we try to find out the reasons behind the fall of Nick Diaz in the UFC.